Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so very much for coming out and being with us today. My name is Marlon White, a third-year student here at the Florida A&M University College of Law. And I'm not going to be before you very long today just to introduce the law school dean. I want to share with you briefly, I remember being in this hall several years ago, being excited to become a law student, learning about torts and contracts and civil procedure. I couldn't wait to get that knowledge. But now after several years, I just couldn't wait to get in law school and learn those things. But now after several years of learning about torts, contracts, I can't wait to get out now. But before coming in, I would have never imagined that, in this law school capacity to be learning about environmental science, water issues, land issues, animal issues, atmospheric issues. So we thank all of our environmental professors for giving us that opportunity. But without further ado, to give opening remarks, introduce you our law school dean, Dean Epps. Thank you.
Well, good morning, and I'm going to start at the end of what I had planned to say because I have been just so very impressed by the hard-charging, we would say, in the Marine Corps, hard-working group of students. My name is Felicia Epps, and I am the Dean of the Florida Agricultural Mechanical University School of Law. I'm honored to serve in that capacity. On behalf of the university, our president, Dr. Larry Robinson, the faculty of the university, students and staff, I'd like to welcome you to the Harmful Algal Blooms Conference.
To get us kicked off today, for our lovely beach weekend, talking about the algal bloom problems in Florida is the incredibly qualified Dr. Kate Hubbard, and obviously I need more coffee because I can't talk. She's currently a research scientist at the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. She's got her BA in biology from the New College of Florida, also has a Master's of Science and a PhD in biological oceanography from the University of Washington. What she's going to be doing is kind of giving us an overview of what we're dealing with, what the problem is, why we're all here, what we can do. So give her a big hand. Like you need it.
Thank you for 2 introductions. So I'm going to give an overview of some of Florida's HAB problems, harmful algal bloom problems. I'm going to give a more saltwater or marine-centric viewpoint because I work for Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, and we deal with the saltwater HABs that are found throughout the state. But we partner very closely with a number of agencies to accomplish that, and we also occasionally work on freshwater issues, especially if there's a wildlife mortality event. So I'll give you a little bit of an overview describing our program as well as some of the problems that we encounter. Are microscopic, single-celled photosynthetic organisms, also known as algae. And these organisms make up the base of the food webs, and only some species are capable of forming harmful algal blooms. These are all different types of algae that we have in Florida. This is a picture of a particular type of algae known as a diatom. And so what we're seeing here are individual cells that are forming a colony or a chain. And in order for these different types of phytoplankton to grow, they need a lot of things from the environment. And so they take up a lot of different components from the environment, and they're helping with cycling those components. And some of those include carbon, nutrients like phosphorus and nitrogen, as well as trace metals and vitamins. Phytoplankton are especially interesting because they are photosynthetic. And so what I've shown here, this is a picture with a light microscope. We can actually excite the chlorophyll pigments, and so algae have chlorophyll, much like terrestrial plants, like trees, and so we can excite those pigments. Those pigments are also involved in photosynthesis, and so I want everyone to take 2 big, deep breaths, And for that second breath, you can think of phytoplankton. All of the different phytoplankton located throughout the world's oceans are responsible for producing roughly half of the air that we breathe. So they're responsible for the same amount of air that the terrestrial plants produce. And so through photosynthesis, these algae are using carbon dioxide, producing oxygen. These algae I mentioned are also at the base of the marine food web. This is a depiction of a simplified food web in the Gulf of Mexico, but you can see that these phytoplankton are located here at the base of the food web. And so we can see that these tiny microscopic organisms are supporting a lot of biodiversity. Today we're focused on harmful algal blooms, and only a small subset of the known phytoplankton that have been identified are actually considered to be harmful. And this subset produces biotoxins. These biotoxins can have negative impacts on wildlife or on human health. And when these toxic algae proliferate, when they grow, when they divide, they can cause blooms. And that's when we have a lot of these cells, and that can cause a lot of issues. Florida has more than 50 described harmful algal bloom species. A few of these bloom annually. We typically, if something blooms annually, have a fairly good response system, monitoring system set up, but we also see a lot of new events. We also see events that occur maybe once every 5 to 10 years. And so trying to respond to these, monitor these, presents challenges. We also have some types of harmful algae that produce only a single type of toxin. We have single species that can produce up to 50 different types of the same toxin. And then we also have single species of algae that can produce very, very different types of toxins. And so you can imagine that studying both the algae as well as these toxins, it's very complex. And so you want to study both the organism as well as understand their physiology, what they're doing in the environment, and how they're producing toxin and how much. We also have a number of different species. I'm going to go into detail about a few of these. And these different species can bloom to different thresholds. And so if I have 5,000 cells per liter of one species, that could cause as many problems as 500 million cells of another species. And so there's a lot of complexity in terms of which algae are blooming, as well as the different types of toxins that are present and the impacts that these can have. So I mentioned that Florida has a lot of different types of harmful algae. Over here on the left, I've given just a quick overview of some of those different types. They span very, very different algal groups. And so these are as different as fish and dogs. And they're quite different. And so we have a number of different algae that are present. Some of these are able to produce potent neurotoxins. Some of these produce harmful impacts but don't have any known toxins associated with them. Some of these produce toxins that can cause issues for wildlife. Ichthyotoxins are toxins that can impact fish. They may not have negative impacts on humans. And so these are some of the most common organisms that we see. However, we also see new different blooms. And so we have to be very flexible in terms of how we respond to these different threats. I wanted to provide a little bit of an overview for why we really focus on these 3 different types of phytoplankton in our monitoring efforts. Karenia brevis, Pyridinium bahamense, these are 2 types of algae called dinoflagellates, as well as the diatom pseudonychia. Each of these is capable of producing neurotoxins, and so I'm going to go through each of the different types of toxins and the syndrome and the human effects that it can have. When shellfish consume these algae, the shellfish can retain the toxins. If people eat the shellfish, that's the primary mode of transfer in terms of human illness. For brevetoxins, if they're consumed in shellfish, they can cause neurotoxic shellfish poisoning. If consumed, there's a number of different symptoms that can result from this. Some of these include tingling, reversal of hot and cold sensation, vertigo, respiratory distress. And these toxins in the cells with wave action, that can bring the cells to the coast, to the beach. As those waves disrupt the cells and they burst open, they can release the toxins in an aerosolized form, and that can also cause respiratory irritation in humans. We also have saxitoxins. Those are produced by Pyridinium bahamense in Florida's waters. Pyridinium is an interesting dinoflagellate. It blooms in the Indian River Lagoon as well as in Tampa Bay, and it can cause bioluminescence. And so if you ever go out kayaking or something at night in the lagoon, this is one of the types of species that can cause bioluminescence or glowing. It can also, unfortunately, cause paralytic shellfish poisoning, and this is probably the best studied shellfish poisoning syndrome. It's also the most prolific in terms of global distribution, and it can cause, not surprisingly based on the name, paralysis, but it can cause a number of other symptoms, including nausea, vomiting, tingling or burning lips, shortness of breath, slurred speech. And saxitoxins are interesting because they can be produced by dinoflagellates, but they can also be produced by cyanobacteria. And so we don't know a lot about how these different toxins are produced in these cells or why. That's something that we're actively trying to figure out. And saxitoxins are interesting because they have recognized a family of genes that are involved with their production. And so that suggests that we may be able to have a better handle in the future on why exactly they're producing these. So the diatom pseudonychia produces domoic acid, and this can cause amnesic shellfish poisoning. And again, this is aptly named. People that eat shellfish that's been contaminated with domoic acid, they can lose the ability to make new memories. And so you lose your short-term memory. And I just wanted to show nationally for these toxins, for NSP, it's really a Gulf of Mexico problem, but these other toxins are national problems and global problems. So we see that PSP is located throughout the country as well as ASP. So in order to deal with both the management and the monitoring, we work very closely with the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. They're the management authority, and they monitor all of the shellfish harvest areas. And we work with a number of other partners also, and we have a whole series of events that we use in responding to and monitoring for harmful algae. And so I just wanted to give you a sense of how we go through this, how we approach that. So we have event response that's informed by collaborative routine monitoring. This occurs throughout the state. I'll give you a sense in a minute of how many samples we get. We also have a fish kill hotline, and we maintain that. Any reports that come in through there, if they're suspected to be an algae involved in a mortality event, we will respond and try to do an investigation. So samples are collected statewide by a number of different partners. We analyze the water and tissue samples. We disseminate this data weekly, bi-weekly sometimes during blooms, to the public as well as to a management audience. And then we're able to take this data and it's automatically transferred and sent off to different collaborators and different agencies where it's then incorporated into tools that we use to predict these blooms and where they might be in 3 days, where they might be later on in the season. I mentioned that we work with a lot of partners, and we have a lot of different tools that we use to track red tide. And these include tools to be able to look at ocean physics and to figure out if we have red tide here, where will that red tide go in the next 3.5 days? We can use tools to look at that. We can also use satellite observations to try to track blooms, and I'll show you a little bit more about that in just a second. So I wanted to talk about Karenia brevis. This is one of the algae that FWC has been working on for a very long time. It's a dinoflagellate that blooms annually in the Gulf of Mexico, and the first observations were in the 1800s. It's called Florida red tide often, but it really doesn't discolor the water in a red color. This is a picture where you can see the bloom on the right, no bloom on the left, so it can discolor water. It mostly occurs in the Gulf of Mexico, and these blooms can cause a lot of different consequences for the environment and for animals, and we'll hear more about that throughout the day. But these blooms can cause fish kills, wildlife mortality, shellfish harvest closures, as well as human respiratory irritation. And this can have a really negative impact on the fisheries, as well as on tourism industries. Our research for this particular type of algae suggests that these blooms start offshore and then they're moved onshore. Once they're close to the shore, the cells are tolerant of a broad range of conditions and they can use a lot of the available nutrients. So this is a video of Carenia brevis. So that picture that I showed before where you saw that hugely dark water mass, that's millions of cells of these guys. And so they have two flagella. They can swim around a little bit, but they're considered plankton, and they drift with the currents. And that's one of the reasons that a lot of our tools for predicting these particular blooms are focused on understanding what the currents are doing and where they're going to be in a few days. I mentioned that we use a number of different tools to track these blooms. This is a salinity model shown on the left. And it has both circulation vectors as well as the colors which indicate salinity. And so we can use this to try to figure out where cells might end up, what the salinity conditions are. They often will move along different salinity gradients, and so this can be a really great way to look at structure in the environment. I mentioned that we use particle tracking, and this is some output from a model. And so basically we input either a drifter or basically just a buoyant blob to simulate a phytoplankton. And then we also have our different Carenia counts that we have for the week. And we simulate what will happen if we put these things in different areas over the next 3.5 days. I mentioned that we use chlorophyll imagery or satellite imagery to try to track blooms. We have remote sensing products that are specifically designed for Carenia brevis. However, there are also other products designed for other types of phytoplankton. So I mentioned cyanobacteria, different types of phytoplankton. There are special chlorophyll products for these different types of algae. We are starting to prepare already for this coming season. This also is not something that's just isolated to Florida. And so I'm not sure how many of you were aware of the Lake Erie situation, but that was due to the same type of algae. They have a very different system in the Great Lakes than we do in Florida. And so it's fairly amazing that we have the same type of algae causing similar issues in both places. But not all of the questions that need to be addressed in both areas are the same. And one of the questions that we really have here is what happens when this algae gets exposed to salt water. And so I guess I would like to just end with sort of a statement. And I think that our future needs require an even more integrated framework with routine and interdisciplinary sampling to tackle these more complex bloom situations, as well as the spatial and temporal interactions within and among trophic levels, so that we can really further develop and refine our practices so that we can have the best management, monitoring, and research that we can. And so with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Barbara McIsaac, and I am a 2L and NOAA Fellow here at FAMU Law. And it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Chuck Jacoby. He has a PhD in biological science, and he's currently a supervising water management district for the St. Johns River Water Management District. He's the leading supervising environmental scientist. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Jacoby.
Thank you, Barbara. What I'm going to do is take you through probably far more ecology than you wanted to hear. And if you understand it all, that means I've failed in my task here today. So, but again, I'll repeat the spoiler that I gave you a little while ago, which was what we're trying to talk about here is the complexity that's involved in trying to manage these things that are part of the natural system. As was pointed out previously, we've had algal blooms before there was a significant amount of human impact, but the problem is that we're driving the pace at which they occur, the duration of them, and the spatial scale of them to some extent by our activities. And that's what we're working to address at this point in time. What I'm going to talk about kind of are the two parts of the Indian River Lagoon, but I'll try to address these questions. First off, I'll give you some background so you're oriented. And again, I would think of this as a kind of a case study. And then we'll talk about some challenges, particularly focused on algal blooms. And I'm going to expand the definition of harmful to move beyond toxins and to talk about an ecological or a more widespread harm. So it's not due to toxins solely that we have harm from algal blooms. Talk a little bit about how we're doing in this very parts of the lagoon. As you can see by what happened, we're not exactly getting the response we're looking for. And then talk about, well, what are we doing in order to resolve that situation? So, first of all, the Indian River Lagoon, if you don't know, it's a very valuable part of the regional economy. A recent estimate was about $7 to $8 billion a year of economic impact. It's along the east coast of the United States. It's about a third of the east coast of Florida. It's very complex. It actually consists of 3 receiving water bodies. Up in the north, Mosquito Lagoon, just below that, Banana River Lagoon, and then the Indian River Lagoon proper. It's a very long system, long and narrow, 156 miles long, shallow, on 3 foot on the average. It's not a river. There's no major from land to ocean flow that drives this system. It's driven by tides, which are actually relatively small, and wind. So it's different from a lot of the other estuaries that are drowned river mouths. And one of the things that happens there is that it has segments. Because of the amount of flushing that goes on, it's divided up into segments that may flush within weeks, if you're right near an inlet, of which there are about 5 major ones, or it may be months to a year for other areas. So that makes these areas different in their sensitivity to a lot of the things that we introduce into the environment. And it also means that we have a very diverse system, partly, or very much for the ecology is very diverse. It's been called one of North America's most diverse estuaries. The politics also, because you stretch that far, it's 5 counties, it's 45 cities, and the challenges have become fairly diverse. It's been challenged for a fair period of time. The first major canals, which is one of the first things that people did when they came to Florida, was try to drain the land so they could use it and not get flooded and be injured and killed. And the first major canals were done in the 1700s around New Smyrna Beach. We really started to get active on draining canals, or draining land, building canals, in around the late 20s and 30s and 40s. In this region, a variety of things started to bring people there. The space program started up in the 50s, but it was in the period 1970 to 1999 that the population actually increased by about 124%. So it was this very rapid increase in numbers of people. And that's probably a big part of why we got behind on keeping up with the impacts of that influx. Problems were first started to be noticed in around 1987 when it was declared a surface water improvement and management water body. That's when one of the things that the water management districts, the groups that there are 5 of those, I work for one, that's one of their tools for getting at environmental impacts. In around 1990, the National Estuary Program was created. The estuary was declared an estuary of national significance, and they developed what they call a comprehensive conservation and management plan. And that also led to a reduction in input from the sewage treatment plants. So they were all taken offline starting in about 1992. But it wasn't until 2000 that the designation of swim water body led to what's called a pollution load reduction goal, or PLURG. That's the abbreviation you see there. And that's the other tool that the Water Management District used to get at, in particular, in this case, nutrient pollution of the lagoon. Well, that triggers, from the Florida Department of Environmental Protection, you get on an impaired waters list, and then the total maximum daily load process begins, the TMDL process. And that was, a TMDL was declared for the lagoon either in 2008 or 2009, depending on where you were. And then 4 or 5 years later, in 2013, the Basin Management Action Plans, which are the responses to being declared impaired, this is where the stakeholders put down what they're going to do to address the issues. So if you look back and say, well, it's 87 to 2013, that's 26 years, give or take. That's a career for a lot of people to get this process going. Now we've become much better at this. We're moving much more quickly to address these issues, but it does take time. So total maximum daily load process covers the whole of the lagoon. What basically that is an estimate of what load of nutrients, in this case, the lagoon can handle. Now, once again, nutrients are important to the health of the lagoon. Without nutrients, you don't have the productivity. Early on, you saw how the nutrients drive the phytoplankton, which drives the food web. Well, that's very true. So once again, you don't want to remove all the nutrients. You want just the right amount. That's a hard thing to hit. So recognizing that it's a hard thing to hit and it's very hard to make these estimates, the whole process uses what's called an adaptive management approach, where you set a target, you move towards the target, you follow certain measures or metrics of the environment that tell you about whether you're succeeding or not, and then you adjust according to what those metrics tell you. So you may have to do more, you may be able to back off a little bit if you're hitting your targets, and the process rolls in that fashion, learning as you go. For the lagoon, seagrasses are a key indicator, and if you don't know what those are, well, that's actually a land plant that learned how to go back and live in the water again. So they're flowering plants that live in salt water. We're going to focus first on the southern end of the lagoon. That's why the Basin Management Action Plan on your far right is highlighted. So moving on to how we're doing. Well, in that part of the world, the St. Lucie estuary in particular, a very big driver of the system are flows from Lake Okeechobee. So Lake Okeechobee has a dike. It's a water storage facility. That dike is not in very good condition, and people are very concerned that if the lake gets too full of water, the dike will break and people down south will get flooded out. And that was built to handle floods because there were a lot of deaths and so forth in some of the major floods in the past. But it's connected as a relief valve, in a sense. It's connected both coasts. And that's the concern for the St. Lucie estuary. In the summer of 2016, we had, as was pointed out earlier, there was a cyanobacterial bloom in the lake, which then got transported as the water was released because that was a very wet year. And it was a very, very wet year south of the lake, which meant they couldn't direct much more water south. So they had to release it east and west. And it just so happened that a lot of the cyanobacteria was concentrated on the release to the east, and so it ended up in the St. Lucie estuary. And that's the green you see. Touched a little bit on cyanobacteria before, blue-green algae. They're actually not algae, but it's a way they're often referred to. But they do have chlorophyll A, and they do photosynthesize. The cyanotoxins are possible, but not always present, and you can't tell by looking. You have to test for them, and they lead to a variety of difficulties for people and animals. And what, as was mentioned, what turns the toxins on and off still remains a bit of a mystery. So this was the particular phytoplankton in question, Microcystis aeruginosa. And again, they're fairly small. But what happened is this bloom got into the estuary. It was probably a combination of the release of fresh water and the push of the tides. It sort of stalled there in the estuary. And then it gets fed a lot of nutrients from the local watershed because that is still impaired for nutrients. So there was a state of emergency declared in Mountain County. They asked for the governor to declare one. He did. There was, signs going up about don't contact the water. There was significant economic loss. A lot of people canceled their reservations to come down for the summer, and they call it the lost summer. When the sampling was done, there were toxin hits in some places, but there were a lot of places where the toxin wasn't present. So, again, you'll see, if you look back to reports in the newspapers, people were on about how high the toxins were. Well, a lot of those samples were taken from docks near shore where the stuff accumulates. It's in the mat of algae. Toxins are often released as the algae break down, so that's a real hot spot. So is it a concern? You bet. Is it as big a concern as it might have been made to be? Possibly not. So what happened? Well, as I mentioned, it was one of the wettest years. It was the wettest dry season since 1932, and that's due to the large-scale El Nino, La Nina cycles of weather. The Everglades was very wet. It was basically flooded. So the releases had to go to those estuaries. The St. Lucie estuary received water for about 280 days. So again, not just the quantity, but the duration was important. And here we see that the testing in Lake Okeechobee found the highest chlorophyll levels. That's a measure of how many of the algae are in the water column. And the highest levels of the toxin down in that sort of southeast corner, which is where the release to the St. Lucie comes from. So it moves over, the freshwater and the tide cancel out, the local nutrient supply feeds it up. Decreased flow, increased salinity eventually happens. Increased salinity will kill these cyanobacteria. They don't handle salty water. So as soon as the freshwater releases dropped down a bit, the salt water came in and the cyanobacteria were killed. So what's the answer? Well, there have been several responses. This is mostly work done with the South Florida Water Management District who fed me this information. They set in place a bunch of temporary operational measures. They want to expedite projects to handle the nutrient inputs and to store water on public lands and also on private lands on a more temporary basis. The Everglades restoration I won't talk about, but that's a big key to this, is to put the water flow back to what it was before. And you can see as you go from your left to the right, the historic flow, the way that it currently flows, most of the water, and then the plan to put it back a little bit the way it was. So I think one of the overall things is Florida used to hold a lot of water on the land. That's very inconvenient for us. We don't like to have our living rooms filled with water. So we have to find this way to restore some of the historic flows. Hold more water up in Kissimmee Chain of Lakes. So this system is connected all the way from just south of here down to Florida Bay. Increase discharges to the south, so work on ways to get more water south, which they're working on, but also to expedite these water holding projects on public lands. So places where the state already holds land, they can store water, build a dike and hold water. Temporary measures are to make use of things that are on private land. That would last for a month or two when you have, say, really heavy rains and you need to hold water. So Florida Power and Light, agricultural ditches, things like that. Okay, moving on. We'll go up to the north now, and there are actually 3 sections, the way that it's divided up for the total maximum daily load process. 3 different basin management action plans, but once again here, seagrasses is very much the key. So that's what I'll focus on. So this is a graph of acres of seagrass, the extent of seagrass beds. And when we looked from 1943 through, we map about every other year. Even in 1943, there looked like there was some challenge to the seagrass beds. As we went along up to 2009, things improved and actually exceeded the target in 2007 and 2009. Now that was a combination of, as you look across the bottom, some good management and some good luck. So wastewater treatment plants, that's the Vero WWTP, the wastewater treatment plant discharges, those were reduced. Other wastewater treatment plants went offline, less nutrients were going into the system. But it was also very dry for a very long period of time from 1996 up to sort of 2009. And when we did get rainfall, it came in large quantities all at once. So the 2004 hurricanes, Tropical Storm Faye, and what that appeared to do was put so much fresh water into the system that it just reset it. So it didn't actually cause a problem, it just sort of flushed the system. All right, so we hit late 2010 and 2011, and that's when things started to come a bit unstuck. We saw in the Indian River Lagoon 2 sort of phytoplankton blooms, microalgal blooms. One we call the super bloom, and that occurred up in the north, and that's what these satellite images that have been processed to show you the amount of chlorophyll. So the hotter colors are higher chlorophyll. And that super bloom occurred up in the north, and we call it that because it exceeded other previously recorded blooms in, say, 25 years of information, both in terms of the amount of chlorophyll and the duration of the bloom. It lasted, as you can see across that bar, for months. Typically, the blooms only last for a month, maybe 2. And typically, the chlorophyll levels are around 30. And the chlorophyll levels in this particular bloom were up around 100 plus. So much more intense. Simultaneously, and perhaps starting a little before, there was another bloom that was down in the central Indian River Lagoon. It didn't reach the high chlorophyll levels, but it lasted a fair period of time. So what we saw was about a 42% loss in seagrasses. Now, you know, seagrasses are an important habitat for a lot of fish and other things. Seagrasses take the nutrients up and hold them. That helps us manage the nutrients in the system. Seagrasses are, you know, a good indicator, and they're a good integrator of water quality. Following on from the 2011 super bloom, we saw the first major brown tide in this Indian River Lagoon. And this is an organism that was the brown tide in Laguna Madre, and there it bloomed sort of pretty continuously for about 8 years. So this was something we didn't want to see head up in the Indian River Lagoon. Now, we did go back and look, and there were brown tide organisms in past samples. They were just never dominant. In 2013, we saw a variety of blooms, and you've heard some of these names already. There were some blooms that didn't even get identified because we didn't have the sampling from them. 2014 was actually a fairly quiet year. So we had from 2011 through 2015, the seagrasses were trying to come back. We were still having blooms. We were still having to reduce light. That's what blooms do to cause seagrass losses. They reduce light. And they were pushing their way back. Then we hit 2016. 2016, sort of late 2015 through 2016, we had a fairly continuous bloom. That was a mix of things, brown tide in the mix. And this is a satellite image, just processed to show what they call true color, so sort of would look like what you would see from space if you were using your eyes. And you can see the Indian River Lagoon on your right. That's the northern part of it. Mosquito Lagoon at the top, Banana River Lagoon to the east, and then the Indian River Lagoon proper towards the shoreline. And on the left-hand side is Lake Apopka. And if you know anything about the water conditions in Lake Apopka, you know that you don't want your water to look like that. So they've been working on that for a while. So what happened? Well, that takes us into what I call ecosystem modeling. And I would like to have some caveats whenever I go into that weird and wonderful world. The first one is a quote from George Box, a statistician, who said, "All models are wrong, some models are useful." The second one is about ecosystems, and it's from a terrestrial ecologist, Frank Egler, who said, "Ecosystems are not only more complex than we think, they are more complex than we can think." And if you don't believe the two eggheads, then you have to believe Yogi Berra, the baseball player, manager, and Hall of Famer, who said it's tough to make predictions, especially about the future. But that's what we're attempting to do. So we built a model. So if we start here in the upper left, no, we won't go through this one, but this is the model that we tried to track everything that we thought might have interacted to cause this problem. This is a more simple version that I like to use to try to explain what we thought we saw. So typically in systems that have what are called rooted macrophytes, like seagrasses, these are plants that live on the bottom, have a root system as well as leaves, versus algae, which don't have a root system. They may have a holdfast, but not a root system, and phytoplankton, the single-celled algae that are up in the water column. Well, systems that have rooted macrophytes, you typically want them to be what's called mesotrophic, so kind of in the middle of the nutrient load spectrum. If it's too much nutrients, the phytoplankton tend to win and the algae tend to win. Too few nutrients and nothing can grow very well. So what typically happens in the system is the nutrient delivery starts to increase. And when you pound on the system, you don't necessarily see an immediate response. What you have in the system are a lot of buffers, and I've listed a few there. But over time, either you get too much nutrients in the system, or one of those buffers or a couple of them start to break or not function as well as they typically do. And very quickly, you get enhanced growth of either phytoplankton or macroalgae. You get shading of the rooted macrophytes, because these things the algae tend to occur higher in the water column. You'll also get this death of some of the macrophytes. They turn over quickly, and when they rot, they use oxygen, and so the oxygen level in the system starts to drop. And the seagrasses fight really hard to produce enough oxygen to put oxygen in their root system to stay alive, because the result of low oxygen is hydrogen sulfide production, and that's toxic. And so they get shaded from above and toxicity from below, and they just get squeezed out of the system very rapidly. So rather than a nice linear change, you see this thing sort of tick along and then it just drops. And that's what we saw. So does the model fit? We know we have increased nutrient delivery to the lagoon. Before the 1920s, the watershed was fairly narrow. It was basically along the I-95 corridor. That was the edge of the watershed, so it didn't go very far inland. It's been increased by canals, and in some places, dramatically. For example, South Florida, the St. Lucie I showed you, that's basically connected all the way up to the Kissimmee River now because of the canal systems. So not only do we take water from a larger area, we move it to the coast very quickly, so it doesn't sit on the land, process the nutrients like it used to. Those nutrients are transported into the receiving water bodies very rapidly. We've also increased the intensity of what we do on the land. So there are, more fertilizers, more cars, more everything that delivers nutrients into the system. So just to give you just one example of what we think we saw happen. In the lagoon, we not only have seagrasses and phytoplankton, we have what are called drift algae. So these are macroalgae. You can see some pictures here that basically are unattached. They roll around on the bottom of the lagoon. They act as a habitat. They take up nutrients, and so in some ways they're beneficial. They can be problematic if they get in large quantities, because again, they can shade seagrasses. They do tend to wash up in people's backyards, which makes people very unhappy. But what we saw in the lagoon was that the biomass of drift algae, which typically goes up and down. So this is the mean drift biomass on the y-axis, and years on the x-axis, the lower axis there. And you can see that in these three places, the different colors, there was a different amount of drift algae at different times. But if you see at the far right, in 2011 and 2012, it didn't come back. We didn't have as much as we typically saw in the seasons when we expected to see it. So a couple of things might have happened. First of all, right off that there's not as much nutrient being taken up now because there's not as much drift algae. And if the drift algae that was there previously in 2010 actually died, it contributes all of the nutrients that it was holding. We think that that was partly what fueled this super bloom. We didn't see an increase in external loads because the rainfall was very low. So we think it was this internal thing. It was in that model that I showed you, it was some of those shock absorbers that went a little crazy at that time. So what are we doing about it all? Well, one of the things we're doing is we're trying to get a better handle on how that system processes nutrients. So mostly we focused on inputs and responses, and now we know we need to spend a little more time about what happens once nutrients get into the system. And to some extent, that's because the system can hold those nutrients for a fairly long period of time. So the goals of this investigation are to understand the inventory and cycling of nutrients in the system, how to look at how processes regulate these blooms, grazing. So phytoplankton are eaten by certain things. Maybe that helps us. Maybe we've changed the grazing rates. We want to take all of this new information. We want to evaluate, recommend, and track management actions to ameliorate the blooms, their magnitude, duration, and frequency. We also may need to go in and facilitate seagrass return. Seagrasses are really good at hanging on to space, but they're not very good at colonizing space. So with that amount of loss that we saw, they may need a leg up to get recolonized. We're also looking at the trophic web. It's possible that we've lost a lot of the filter feeders. Clams used to be a big industry in the lagoon. The information we have indicates clams are not that prevalent in the lagoon anymore. So we may need, again, to restore some of these aspects of the system in order to help us. We've also found some interesting things about the way the system operates. So we found that there are what we call legacy loads. So this is the accumulated organic matter from human activities on land primarily. And they generate an internal load. So what in the lagoon they call it muck. So it's not it doesn't have a huge amount of organic matter in it, but has more organic matter than the typical sediment. And as that rots, as the bacteria break down the organic matter, they release the nutrients, in particular ammonium, which seems to fuel brown tides. So again, it's this interaction. We know that we think and are looking at how drift algae play a role in the cycling. So we have better data now on what would happen if you had a loss of drift algae and what kind of nutrients would get into the system. We've looked at these small phytoplankton that have made up these recent blooms. They're different from the ones we usually see. They're different from the pyridinium. They're different from the diatoms. And they turn over very quickly, and they take up nutrients in a different way. We now know that these small phytoplankton can use what are called organic nutrients. So that's nitrogen and phosphorus that's attached to carbon. That's not typical for phytoplankton. They usually need bacteria to break off the nitrogen and phosphorus so they can get at it. These ones can do that on their own, so they skip a step in the cycle, which means they go faster and there's not as much loss as they go through the different steps. We also know that some of these small phytoplankton are not favored by grazers. So if there's anything else to eat, they'll eat that first. They may eat the small ones, but they're certainly going to leave them if they can. So where do we go from here? So some of the things we're trying to do. Restore historic flows. So a lot of the water in the northern part of the Indian River Lagoon used to go to the St. Johns River. Used to go through a series of marshes and so forth until it got collected up enough to form the St. Johns River. It was diverted to the lagoon to drain that land because the lagoon's downhill, and that was the simplest way to get the water off the land, is to dig a canal. Not simple, but simplest at the time. So what we're doing now is we're basically pumping it back to where it used to go through a bunch of treatment wetlands and so forth, so that the water that reaches the St. Johns is in good shape. Obviously a slightly expensive approach to putting water back where it belongs, but it's the one that we have at hand. So you have to actually operate pumps on a regular basis. And what this shows you is these treatment areas on your left, and the little symbols there are the pumps. So they're places where water gets pumped back. So that reduces the amount of water that goes to the lagoon. We're trying to address these legacy loads. So this muck that I talked about forms a lot and predominantly near the tributaries that come into the lagoon, because the canals usually empty into one of these small tributaries. They collect up this material. Once the water flow slows, it drops out of the water and ends up on the bottom. So, for example, they're dredging the mouth of the Algal River, removing 625,000 cubic yards of this muck, which is like 20,000 good-sized dump trucks of muck. And that hopefully will reduce the nutrient loads to the system. We're also trying to restore within the system some of the things that we've done that reduce its effectiveness, that change those shock absorbers in that model that I showed you. And for example, wetlands are often called the kidneys of the system. So wetlands will take water, and the wetland plants will remove the nutrients. Well, for mosquito control, we altered a lot of the wetlands, either put dikes around them and impounded them to hold water, or dug ditches through them. Dragline ditches is what they're called. And that was because the salt marsh mosquito, one of the real problematic mosquitoes in this region, needs this cycle of damp soil to lay the eggs and then water to let the larvae metamorphose. So by breaking that cycle, by holding water, they felt they could control mosquitoes better. Well, we've learned that you can do both, and so that's what we're trying to do. Again, filter feeders. Oysters, particularly up in the northern reaches of the lagoon, were probably very important in terms of turning over the water. Oysters filter a tremendous amount of water. And some of those reefs are being damaged by things like boat wakes and so forth. So trying to return some of those reefs to health. In particular, the district is not the only player in the game, and Brevard County has stepped up to the plate in the recent past. They have a sales tax now that'll generate $34 million a year for the next 10 years to address simply restoration of the Indian River Lagoon. So that's $340 million over 10 years. And their focus, they're trying to focus on all the major players. So dredging, that's a picture of someone holding muck. In the center there is a core that shows you when the muck started in about the 50s and how it's built up, in the 2000s. But this program also is looking at septic to sewer. So some of the hassles may be that septic systems and coastal systems may not go together very well. Nitrogen in particular will get into the water and head to the lagoon. And education. Fertilizer use is pretty much an educational effort. It's convincing people that it makes more sense to use less fertilizer, even if your lawn isn't quite as green as it might have been. And that applies to farmers as well. And There are, best management practices that are being developed. And typically what happens is that's both good for the homeowner or the farmer and good for the environment. What are my take-home messages? Well, in terms of management, events might matter, and it's not something for nutrients that we think about a lot. We tend to manage towards averages, but we may have to think a little more about how we manage events, because that super bloom that we saw was a conjunction of meteorological events, probably I'd call it, that led us to the problem. Restoration is underway and planned, and I mentioned the Brevard County's efforts that'll take place over the next 10 years. And lastly, it took us a while to get here, so expect it to take us a while to get back to where we want to be. And this graph is meant to sort of show you the way nonlinear things might happen. It's just basically a model. So as stress goes up, on the x-axis, you'll see the condition may drop, but it won't drop linearly. Again, there's this sort of hysteresis. There's a lag in the system. And you might see a similar kind of lag as you try to push it back along that stress axis to get back to the condition you're seeking. You may have to push it further than when you saw the first change. And that's what we're trying to do now.
I'm here to introduce Josie Balzac. She's admitted into the state of Florida. She is actually a visiting assistant professor at Rollins College. She teaches business law, ethics, and business sustainability. She holds her JD here. She's an alumni here and was valedictorian. She is wonderful. She received her LLM at in international environmental law at George Washington University Law School. She is a frequently educating and is an activist for environmental justice, sustainability development, climate change, human rights, food, and social justice issues. She has also been a part of promoting climate justice by doing a divestment of fossil fuels and social responsibility for the climate justice case studies of global and regional governance, which was edited by our dean here, Randall Abate. And she'll be speaking now. Thank you.
I don't know why my cell phone's there. Hi, everyone. As always, I am so honored and humbled to be at my alma mater again, especially speaking about an issue that is extremely important to all of us and something that I'm extremely passionate about. So they asked me to speak on climate change, and I'm not really quite sure why I'm out of breath. I literally walked from the table to the podium, and I find myself trying to catch my breath at the moment. They asked me to speak on climate change and hazardous algal blooms, hence the reason why I posed the question, because it is something extremely important that we now have to start taking into consideration in the planning and in trying to be proactive in resolving these issues in the management, because there are many synergistic effects that are occurring because of the impacts of climate change and the causes of climate change, which are man-made. So two things that are similar in the cause of hazardous algal blooms and climate change is that we're the problem, right? It's man-made. I don't want to get into a political discussion about it. Hopefully I'm preaching to the choir. So there's carbon dioxide and methane and nitrous oxide, nitrogen, and that is going into our atmosphere. And that is all caused by human-induced activities, the burning of fossil fuels, decomposition of waste in our landfills, agriculture. A lot of people always want to focus on just the burning of fossil fuels, but agriculture, actually 33% of climate change is attributed to our food production systems. And then we also have biomass burning and the use of organic fertilizers that is also causing climate change. So Neil deGrasse said, and I started to wonder, I'm like, man, I don't think I put a quote, and then I realized I did. People who deny human-induced climate change are badly misinformed. This position is neither politically liberal nor conservative, it's factual. And then you have human-induced nutrient pollution, and I know this is stuff that we've all been hearing about throughout the conference all day. But so commercial agriculture and farming, urban and population-related resources, atmospheric deposition, so from all of our burning of fossil fuels and the cars, all of that is going into the air and then into our waters, and just a natural land in general. So these were just some, I actually did have a pie chart as well. That's kind of interesting for me. So what are the climate change impacts on HABs? So the changing environmental conditions worldwide are affecting fresh and marine waters. And the warming of the temperatures is giving hazardous algal blooms a competitive advantage in being able to grow. So there's the warmer water temperatures, there's changes in salinity, there's increases in atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations, the changes in rainfall, which we heard, right, when the storms come and these extreme weather events, we have significant heavy rains for sustained periods of time. And then the melting of the polar ice caps, which is creating sea level rise, creating the warmer temperatures, and creating and allowing a lot more light to come in. And I'm going to show you a very short video from NASA where they're finding these hazardous algal blooms underneath the ice sheets, which is something that they've never seen before. So it's all very concerning. But I want to go back a little bit because I did mention that this was all human-induced, right? And so it all started back with the Industrial Revolution. And so as we've become more and more industrialized as a nation and as a world in general with globalization and it's spreading and developing countries are becoming more developed and even more industrialized, this is having a significant impact on degrading our environment. Yes, of course, it was an economic revolution. You have a new middle class, wages and standards of living increased, life expectancy increased, and we have a significant amount of technological advances in telecommunications, which has provided us, with a better quality of life. But at the same time, we've continued to treat Earth and all of its natural resources as commodities, as objects that are here only for our use. We don't treat nature with the respect that it deserves. Not sure why we haven't come to this realization that we need nature to survive, that we need to breathe clean air, that we need to have clean water in order for us to have our human rights realized. And so by treating Earth continuously as a commodity, we have this, for a long time, this thought that the Earth was just vast and immense and all of these resources were infinite for us to be able to use. And now we have come to the realization that they're finite. And we're having water security issues, we're having air pollution, and we're having all of these things affect us because we've treated Earth as a commodity. And we have not come to this realization yet that we're interdependent and that we're interconnected with each other and that we all need each other to thrive. So I say this because as an attorney and as learning and in teaching law, it's very important to recognize, and as we've talked about, you need to have education and awareness, and you need to have a shift of conscious and a shift of social and cultural norms in order for new laws to pass. There was a time where legally slavery was allowed, right? This was the law, and people were property. And we needed to change that mentality and that social conscience in order for people to understand that that was wrong. So not just because something something is legal, and I have one of my students from my business law and ethics class, and this is what we do the entire semester, is we walk through this line of what is legal and what is ethical, and a lot of times they don't align. So just because something is legal doesn't necessarily mean that it's ethical, and we need to have more education and more awareness and understanding that we need to shift this mentality of treating Earth as a wastebasket, but actually treating it with the respect that it deserves in order for us to be able to lobby our legislators and bring it to the political agendas so that we can have new laws made to protect our environment and our rights as humans. So environmentalism at the very beginning, it was just concerned really with conservation, right? We were conserving lands and things, and then you had Rachel Carson, who comes out with the Silent Spring that says, wait, there's all these chemicals and all of these things, and we're poisoning our Earth, and in turn, it's going to poison us back, right? And so that created this entire environmental movement and awareness, and we've realized that there's chemicals and poisons and toxics in our waters, in our air, in our foods, in our soil. They're everywhere, and we need to figure out proactive measures to combat that. And then you have Thomas Berry, who's created this legal framework of Earth jurisprudence, which is giving nature rights, giving nature standing. Trees don't have standing. I can't go and speak on behalf of a tree, and that is something that we need to change in order for us to be able to move, because it's no longer taking little baby steps, all right? We've been knowing about this for over 40-something years, and now we need to take leaps and bounds. It's not just little steps here and there, and it needs to be all of society coming together. Us as individuals need to take actions. We need to push governments to take actions, and we need to push corporations and businesses to take actions because they actually have more capital and resources to be able to combat a lot of these things. And not necessarily only through regulations, it can also be done through free market mechanisms with voluntary initiatives that these corporations should know that us as consumers, right? Because corporations run by us as consumers, and we as consumers don't recognize the power that we actually have in keeping these corporations in business. So when we demand certain things, those corporations will give us what we demand. The market will respond. So we need to make sure that we continue to push this so that they respond accordingly. So industrial activities have raised atmospheric carbon dioxide levels from 280 parts per million to 400 parts per million in the last 150 years. And we've had warnings that if we pass that 350 parts per million, that we could go past the point of no return, right? And we've already exceeded that. So there's significant measures that we have to take now in order to protect our environment, most importantly for our future generations, right? We can't just think of things short term. We have to think of long term, and our children and our children's children and their children, we want them to enjoy the earth as much as we have. This is one of those fancy slides. Environmental and social threats. So I've already talked about climate change. You have, and I've talked about air, water, soil pollution, water quality and security. We have population growth. We have poverty, food security, natural resource scarcity and overexploitation, extreme weather, waste, chemical toxics, loss of biodiversity. I promise I'm not going to be all doom and gloom. We are going to be able to get out of this, and I have faith in every single person in this room that you will be the change that you wish to see in the world, and that was Gandhi, not me. Climate change is a threat to our existence. Life, health, food, water, ecosystems, property, displacement. We have a significant amount of climate refugees, but unfortunately under the definition of a refugee, they're not protected under the UN, so those are also measures that we have to change. So you get injuries and fatalities and mental health impacts with severe weather, asthma and cardiovascular disease with air pollution, all different types types of diseases such as malaria, dengue, Lyme disease, West Nile virus with changes in vector ecology, increasing allergens, respiratory allergies, and asthma. It's such a prominent thing now. So many children have asthma, especially in low-income and minority communities where they have a significant amount of factories or coal-fired power plants around them, because let's be honest, those things aren't put in very affluent white neighborhoods. You have water quality impacts, cholera, HABs, malnutrition, and other diarrheal diseases from water and food supply impacts, environmental degradation, forced migration, and civil conflict. This is a huge national security concern, climate change, not just in the US, but all around the world. We are already having water wars. Think of Syria. Extreme heat and related illnesses and death. So these are all different impacts of climate change on human health, and I know throughout the conference you've heard about the impacts of HABs on human health as well. So environment and human rights and earth rights, this is what got me, and I will have to thank, and I still call him Professor Abate till this day, even though he tells me to call him Randy. When I took as an international environmental law class, I was telling some of the students here, I came to law school, I just wanted to be a lawyer. I've had worked as a paralegal and a secretary in the field before I even started law school. And I just went in to pass law school and take the bar until I took his class. And I realized there's a whole world out there that needs changing, and I want to be the one to change and help it. And what really connected me with the environment was environmental justice and the connection with the environment and our human rights, which I touched upon just a moment ago. So life and dignity are only possible where people have access to an environment with certain basic qualities, when we have clean air and clean water and clean food and clean soil. And here, especially in the state of Florida, we're having a significant concern with clean water due to these hazardous algal blooms. We saw it last summer, where in March they already had a bloom. NOAA reported it on March 2018 with warnings for health effects, and we're only in March. So I'm very concerned as to what we're going to see this summer, and I would love to work with St. John Waters Management in any way possible to see how we can be very proactive in preventing this from happening again. So you have substantive rights that are human rights to life and such, and then you also have procedural rights, so right to access to information and be able to participate in the political process and in the decision making, right? We need to have our voices heard and have seats at the table in order to really make some great decisions. It needs to be a stakeholder approach with all members of society to be there to create these solutions. And then I'm a strong advocate to give earth rights. And we are communities of life, we're all interconnected, and we all have a right to thrive and exist simply for just being. So I wanted to touch upon some of the climate change impacts in Florida specifically. So I had the opportunity to go to Miami a few weeks ago, and we went as part of a conference to Ground Zero in Miami, and they're having so many different impacts in terms of flooding. They've spent over $400 million to get drainage systems in and lift roads and lands because all of the flooding is already coming in. That's creating saltwater intrusion. You have flooding during high tide, amplified storm surges, potentially permanent inundation, landward migration of freshwater wetlands, and reduced capacity of flood control structures. So Florida is extremely vulnerable. It is the most vulnerable state in the nation, yet we still here in Florida haven't fully accepted the fact that climate change is real. We don't have a climate change action plan, even though we need one 10 years ago, right? So we're way behind the times. We have the second longest coastline in the U.S. at 1,350 miles. 3/4 of the population reside in coastal counties that generate 79% of the state's total economy. The insured value of property in Florida's coastal communities totals $2.9 trillion. South Florida sits above a porous limestone plateau, which is why we're advocating very hard to ban fracking here in the state of Florida, because we're not clay, we're limestone, we're extremely porous, and that's completely different than fracking in many other states. And I would, be an advocate to ban fracking anywhere. I'm just saying it's really bad here. The OECD lists Miami as the #1 most vulnerable city in the world in terms of property damage. So this is over Bangladesh and other third world countries because there's so much infrastructure in Miami. And I just went there and they're continuing to build all of these condos, like, high rises. And I'm just, it's very concerning to me. OECD lists Miami as #9 most vulnerable in terms of population exposed to coastal flooding in 2070s. And then the Keys, of course, are the most at-risk area in the U.S. So projected sea level rise, I think you said Yogi Berra. Well, I don't remember the quote right now, but we can't predict specifically what's going to happen in the future. So these estimates are very vast, right? So 7 inches up to 24 inches of potential sea level rise in the next 30 years or more. Worst projections are 2 feet by 2048, 3 feet by 2063, and 4.1 to 6.6 feet by 2100. So literally South Florida would be underwater. Business as usual. I just spoke to some of the students about this. We got to get out of that mentality. We cannot continue trying to create solutions with this business as usual mentality. That is extinct. It's over. We need to be innovative and creative and focus on finding solutions that are not the typical solutions that we've been using in the past. There's a increase in saltwater intrusion, I discussed that already. Rise of flood insurance premiums. Some people in South Florida and the Keys have reported that their insurance premiums are higher than their actual mortgages. So that is extremely significant to many property owners. We're already trying to figure out how we're going to live check to check and put food on the table. And now you add a premium on top of that, and it's not a sustainable way of moving forward. There's even been discussions of property sellers potentially being sued if they don't disclose the sea level rise that could potentially happen. So how do you solve climate change? You do it through mitigation strategies and adaptation strategies as well. So mitigation is the reduction of greenhouse gases, the focusing and moving towards renewable energy sources, hence taking away that business as usual mentality. And this has a beneficial effect on the entire global system. And the purpose of mitigation is to solve the climate change problem. You also have adaptation, which is why it's extremely important to create these climate action plans. So climate change, it's real. It's here. We're experiencing the threats worldwide. What are we going to do about it? Not only how are we going to stop it, but how are we going to adapt to it? What kinds of things do we need to implement in order to adapt to these changes that we're experiencing with our climate? There needs to be a focus on promoting sustainable economic growth, identifying these vulnerable communities and countries, and implementing measures to facilitate this adaptation. There's a socioeconomic impact, right? And so you have to look at all 3 of these pillars, which I'm going to show you in a moment, the social, the economic, and the environment, in order to push forward with a sustainable outcome. So here it is, sustainable development. Many of you guys have heard of the triple bottom line. If you haven't, now you have. The triple bottom line, people, planet, profit, right? And so on the far left is usually the model that's shown, right, having a balanced approach to these three pillars. But I want to take you all the way to the end, because that's the one that I advocate for. We need to take care of our environment first, because going back to what I had originally said, it's the only way that we survive. And so the economy doesn't matter if we're not here. If we don't have a clean and healthy environment, we don't have a society. So that needs to be a priority when we're implementing and trying to figure out solutions. So the history of sustainable development, I told you guys we've been talking about this since 1972, and we are worse off perhaps than we were back then. So we need to start taking leaps and bounds and not just steps. It happened at the Stockholm Declaration. It was the first conference to focus this on the international attention. In 1979, we had the first World Climate Conference. In 88, the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, was created. In 90, we created the Second World Climate Conference, which is where there was the push for a United Nations framework on climate change. In 94, it finally entered into force. And it wasn't until 2015 that we finally had over 196 countries agree that climate change was real when we signed the Paris Agreement. So before we signed the Paris Agreement in 2015, the world came together to focus on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals of 2030. They were the millennial goals, and now they've become the SDGs of 2030. And so there's 17 specific goals, and within each goal, there's a significant amount of targets. If you haven't gone to this website, I would highly recommend that you go. Click on it, peruse around, and just see all of the different goals and targets and focuses that the entire world is focusing on right now. Unfortunately, I think here in the United States, we're rather behind the times on this. I do international research. I research 10 to 30 countries every single month, and the entire international community has already accepted the fact that climate change is real. They're implementing measures and policies and regulations that meet these goals and targets. They are actually talking about the Paris Agreement and different climate actions that they're pushing forward. And I'm talking China, Thailand, South America. Europe is way beyond. I mean, they're on the verge of creating a zero-waste society. They're focusing on renewable energies, and we are one of the main contributors of fossil fuel, being emitted, and we need to make sure that we start to take action and push our governments to take action. And if we're not going to see change on a federal level, then we need to push for action on a local level. And I feel very strongly about our environmental community here in Orange County and Central Florida. And we have been very active in making changes here on a local level on the Orange County Commission and the mayor and the city of Orlando as well. And I'd be more than happy to talk to any of you regarding that to show you how you can get involved. So I told you about the UN Paris Agreement. So after 21 years, we finally come to an acceptance that climate change is real and that we need to implement measures in order to reduce the temperature to 2 degrees, actually focusing it on 1.5 degrees, and that's through mitigation and also adaptation. Countries have submitted certain plans and showing how they're going to mitigate and reduce their greenhouse gases, but unfortunately the plans that they've submitted still gets us at like 3 and change degrees, which is way worse than we need to be. So there needs to be significant push to reduce those greenhouse gases even further. So they've created a transparency system, a loss and damage system. They've created a fund to help these vulnerable and developing countries, and that's all part of the UN Paris Agreement. So the goal is that all of these targets that the countries have submitted would be the floor, and they're just going to increase their reductions as time goes on. So why? Why did we create this Paris Agreement? Why did we create the UN Sustainable Development Goals? Well, 1 in 5 people still lack access to modern electricity. 3 billion people rely on wood, coal, charcoal, or animal waste for cooking and heating, yet we're all day brushing our teeth with the water running and leaving all of our lights on, but yet there's people in other parts of the world that don't even have access to electricity. Energy is the dominant contributor to climate change, accounting for around 60% of total global greenhouse gases, and reducing that carbon intensity is a key objective in long-term climate goals. Water. 1 in 10 people lack access to safe water. We're looking at 663 million people. At least 1.8 billion people globally use a source of drinking water that is fecally contaminated. Water scarcity affects more than 40% of the global population, is projected to rise. 2.4 billion people lack access to basic sanitation services such as toilets, and more than 80% of wastewater resulting from human activities is discharged into rivers or seas without any pollution removal. Food and hunger. Globally, 1 in 9 people in the world today are undernourished. 42.2 million Americans live in food insecure households, including 29 million adults and 13 million children. And we have a huge problem with food waste, and organic waste is the second highest component of landfills, which is the largest source of methane emissions, which is 27 times more potent than the carbon dioxide. Waste. We live in a cradle to grave society, and we need to be in a cradle to cradle society, meaning having a full closed loop versus buy something and then just throw it away. The average American creates more trash than anyone else on earth, throwing away 7.1 pounds of garbage a day. Yeah, it's a lot of trash taking out, right? And the cost of dealing with this trash is very significant. And so this is exactly what I had just mentioned, but it just shows you that life cycle analysis. And the reason I'm talking about all of this is because this is our problem. We're creating it, and we're going to have to be the ones to create solutions to solve it. So going back to this slide, which I showed you at the very beginning, this is where I'm going to talk about these impacts. So climate change causes warmer temperatures, right? We know this. A temperature rise, HABs growth is promoted over non-harmful algae. So they have a competitive advantage with this warmer temperature. There's an increase in thermal stratification. HABs are able to obtain nutrients in surface waters and migrate up and down to get into deeper waters as well. So they're able to get all of the nutrients that they need and basically outgrow all these other algae. The decrease in viscosity of water, so small aquatic organisms can vertically migrate, making it easier to float to the surface, and then HABs absorb light from the sun, which then increases the surface water temperature as well. Salinity is a big issue. So extreme weather events such as droughts are increasing. We saw this happen in California. It's happening in South America, in Brazil, and in Mexico. I researched them recently. And it's crazy because on one side they're having significant droughts, and then on the other side they're having significant rainfall. So in some parts of their country they're creating and implementing policies to stop the droughts, and then on the other side it's too much rain, right? And so in Brazil, there's a reservoir right now which feeds out to 5 million people, and they say there's only like 5 months more of this water. And so they're looking at extreme measures such as like rain capturing and things. How are they going to get water to these people? So the amount of water flowing into lakes and the reservoirs decrease, which increases that salinity. Warmer temperatures cause more evaporation. Water levels of the fresh water decrease, which increases the salinity in the water. And then this is an invasion of marine algae to go into fresh water systems as well. Carbon dioxide, so all algae require CO2 for photosynthesis. An increase of CO2 in the air increases the levels of dissolved carbon in marine and fresh water. HABs can have greater access to CO2 for growth because they can directly utilize the CO2 from the atmosphere to grow. Ocean acidification, there's a general decline in ocean pH. And you guys ever had a fish tank? Nobody in here has had a fish tank? That's just crazy. Okay, come on now. Let's raise your hands. It's so difficult, right, to keep that pH in there. You know, if you any little significant change in there, you start to see the green algae form. Or that's why a lot of people don't have saltwater fish tanks, right? Because they're like, oh, it's too much work. Yeah, it is. And that's why any little bit of added nutrient or carbon or all of these things throws off that pH balance in the water, and that's what's creating these hazardous algal blooms. So the general decline in ocean pH, there's more acidic conditions from the increasing concentrations of carbon dioxide, the increase in CO2, the lower pH, and the low oxygen conditions, nutrient loading and acidification promote growth and increase toxicity of red tide, brown tide, all the different tides out there. So rainfall and extreme weather events is also having a huge impact on the creation of HABs. So this increase in extreme weather events, you guys have seen it all over the news. We experienced almost a huge, we got lucky that huge hurricane didn't hit us. So intense storms with heavy, consistent rain causes runoff to transport the nutrients from land into water bodies. And as we heard, all of this flooding, then it's very difficult to manage those events, and a lot of times they come up unexpectedly, right? And that's why they're extreme weather. We're not sure when they're going to occur. So droughts that follow then causes the water to retain those nutrients in there for a longer period of time, so it's harder to get those nutrients out of the water. You also have the melting of polar ice caps, shrinking. Thinning Arctic sea ice appears to be accelerating the growth of algae in popular waters. Arctic melt ponds are bringing in more light earlier during the summer seasons. So a lot of these things are unprecedented, right? These scientists haven't seen these things before, and it's difficult to figure out how to solve this issue when it's something that we may have not experienced in the past. So we don't have that screwdriver that we can just take out and and I don't even know what to do with it. I'm sorry, I admit, right? So you can't just bring that out and try to fix it because we don't have those tools necessarily, and we haven't had these problems in the past. So some solutions for HABs and climate change is actions are required for both. We can't live in this vacuum anymore. We have to understand the synergistic effects of both and talk about both in these planning and implementation. Additional research must be funded. We need more research. We need to figure out why this is happening, what's causing it, and so we need funding, and I understand that. We need funding from government to conduct and fully understand these implications. Past management approaches are no longer adequate because you have a completely different beast now that's taking over and having a significant impact. We need to figure out nitrogen and phosphorus reduction strategies, but as you saw in Alaska, they're having issues and they're not having agricultural runoff dump right into that specific area. So this is one cause, but it's not the only cause. We need to mitigate our fossil fuels and reduce those greenhouse gases, and then have alternative fertilizers and obviously alternative renewable energy. So we need to create climate change action plans. Countries already around the world are starting to create them. We don't have one here in the US, and we definitely don't have one here in Florida, and we need one ASAP. So like I said, every major city needs a climate change plan, or else we're going to start to see everyone going under. Climate change plans and public participation. I'm a huge advocate in getting everyone involved and participate in these decision-making processes. It's not just having certain government officials or scientists. We need young people. We need politicians on board. We need academics. We need lawyers. We need civic society. We need organizers. We need activists. We need everyone to meaningfully participate in this process in order for us to find real solutions. I teach 18 to 22-year-olds and some even older, and they have so many amazing ideas and ways to change the world, and they haven't been domesticated and kept in this box, and they believe that these things are possible, and we need to engage them more, and if we listen, we may be able to find a quicker and faster solution. We need cost-effective technology, scientific engineering, organizational adaptation, mitigation solutions are not enough. We have to motivate and empower societies to adopt these needed changes. Going back to what I originally talked about, we need to change our conscious, we need to create our social and cultural norms, because that is the only way that we're going to move forward. Renewable energy, I've quickly mentioned this, but wind power, solar, geothermal, biofuel, and hydro power are 5 major types of renewable energy sources that we need to start focusing on. We are called the Sunshine State, and we have very, very minimal amount of use of solar power here. Germany, I believe, is leading, but we're the Sunshine State, so we need to embrace that name and make it so. And I did write a chapter on divestment of fossil fuels. So that is a campaign I will advocate for. If you haven't already divested from some of these big banks and joined First Green Bank, I highly suggest you do it ASAP, or some of these credit unions. Check your 401ks, see where your investments are. I can guarantee you they're in some type of fossil fuel or reprehensible industry that you don't necessarily want it to be in. So start aligning your values and your morals with your actions, and take those steps, because ethically it's the right thing to do, even though you're not legally bound. So Desmond Tutu said, is a huge role model, people of conscience need to break their ties. It makes no sense to invest in companies that undermine our future. Climate justice, we need to not just talk about mitigating climate change and adapting, but also focusing on the justice aspect in terms of climate change impacts. So climate justice links human rights and development to achieve a human-centered approach, safeguarding the rights of the most vulnerable and sharing the burdens and benefits of climate change and its resolution equitably and fairly. The climate injustice is that people most vulnerable and marginalized are the ones that have had little to do with generating the greenhouse gas emissions that cause climate change, yet they're the ones feeling the worst impacts. So I wanted to touch upon a local fertilizer ordinance, and I was so happy to hear that there's a complete ban during the summer surrounding in the St. John Water Management District. In Seminole County, they just passed the most stringent fertilizer ordinance in the entire state of Florida. And so these are some of the key focuses as to why it's so great. So fertilizer containing, and I will give a shout out to Marjorie Holt with the Sierra Club. She is a huge advocate for this, so I reached out to her and she provided this information. So I have to make sure I give credit to her. Fertilizer containing nitrogen or phosphorus cannot be applied to turf during the restricted season from June 1st to September 30th. This is the rainy months. Fertilizers containing iron, manganese, and other micronutrients are also referred to as summer blends, can be applied during the restricted season to keep lawns healthy and green. Fertilizer containing nitrogen that is used during the non-restricted season, October 1st through May 31st, must contain at least 50% or more slow-release nitrogen. The slow-release nitrogen content will increase to 65% 3 years after adoption of the fertilizer ordinance to allow time for educational outreach to residents and retailers. And that's why I say it's very important to have stakeholder approaches, right? Because this has an impact on the industry of fertilizer, right? This has an impact in terms of economic gain and money now that they have to spend. So we need to, take them into consideration as well and figure out how we can create sustainable solutions together that is helpful for all. No fertilizers may be applied within 15 feet of any pond, lake, or stream, canal, or other water body, including wetlands. So, all of you that want to get active, Orange County is getting ready to amend their fertilizer ordinance. We saw the one amendment. It is not strong enough. We want them to go as strong as Seminole County. And we will be there at Orange County Commission hearings, public comment, lobbying meetings, or whatever we need to do to push our local officials to get a stronger ordinance in Orange County and clearly in Osceola County as well, because as we learn, Kissimmee, right, that's where that water is coming from. And there's a lot of agriculture there, and we need to make sure that we implement these ordinances there as well. Excuse me. Corporate social responsibility. I talked about no longer business as usual, and this is really focusing on that stakeholder approach of people, planet, and profit, and focusing on governance, transparency, and accountability measures, and really focusing on that triple bottom line to improve the quality of life for all. Meaningful public participation, again, I'm going to continue to say it over and over again. We need to build awareness by providing access to information, engage all stakeholders, have regular meetings and workshops, an opportunity for meaningful dialogue and effective participation in the decision-making process. And I will leave you with Leo, which is the name of my dog. I named him after Leo, which I just adopted. I was telling Perry. Climate change is real. It's happening right now. It's the most urgent threat facing our entire species, and we need to work collectively together and stop procrastinating. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.